Dear colleagues, good afternoon. We're glad to welcome you all. My name is Andrei Sushentsov. I'm the Dean of the School of International Relations at MGIMO. Today we have the third lecture in a series of lectures on the various aspects of the Ukrainian crisis. This course of lectures is an initiative of our students, and we thank them very much for this initiative. With the help of our best analysts, researchers, and field experts, we aim to discuss the most urgent and practically significant aspects of the Ukrainian crisis within the framework of 8 meetings. The topic of today's lecture is dedicated to the fate of the Minsk agreements. The title of the lecture is The Short Life of the Minsk Agreements: Why Did Diplomacy Not Work? The speaker who will present this topic today is Nikolay Silaev, a senior research fellow and the director of the Laboratory of International Trends Analysis at the Institute for International Studies. He is one of the leading Russian experts on the post-Soviet space and its conflicts. Dr. Silaev's expertise is not limited to Ukraine. We met about 13 to 14 years ago when we studied the same Caucasian country and conducted a lot of field research there. We have many memories, fond and not so much, related to this very important experience for Russian foreign policy. During a long-standing acquaintance, I have always admired Dr. Silaev's professional and personal qualities. I know him as a brilliant specialist in the post-Soviet space, a keen intellectual, and a great patriot.
Пространству, неравнодушного интеллектуала и большого патриота.
Today, Dr. Silaev will not only share his own opinion about why the Minsk agreements were so short-lived and why diplomacy did not allow us to settle our differences with Ukraine in this way, after all. He will also share his assessments and tell us what he can about the non-public side of the negotiations.
Он поделится и своими оценками, но и из того, что ему позволено, он расскажет о внутренней стороне этих переговоров. Николай Юрьевич участвовал.
Dr. Silaev participated as an expert in these negotiations on the Russian side, saw the Ukrainian negotiators, saw the negotiators of the unrecognized Donetsk and Luhansk People Republics, now recognized by Russia. He is probably one of those experts in our country who can present a systematic, exhaustive, and convincing vision of why the Minsk agreements did not work out. We're really lucky to have such a specialist at our university, and I'm especially proud that I can consider Dr. Silaev a good friend of mine. I would like to give him the floor and thank him for sharing his expertise with us today. Dr. Silaev, the floor is yours. Thank you very much, Dr. Sushentsov, for this flattering introduction. I think that this will be the most boring lecture of the series, because in it I will try to avoid any big political assessments and big generalizations, focusing merely on the diplomatic practice, which attempted to resolve the conflict in Donbass on the basis of the Minsk agreements.
Состояла попытка урегулировать конфликт на Донбассе на основе и на базе Минских соглашений.
I'll tell you a little bit about how I got to this point. The fact is that in 2015, from around August until the end of the year, and then from March 2017 to March 2020, I was an expert in the Russian delegation that conducted these negotiations.
Я был экспертом в составе российской делегации, которая вела эти переговоры.
The negotiations were conducted at the level of a contact group and working groups that were formed to focus on different areas of the contact group's work. I was an expert in the political working group, and in this capacity, I participated in the negotiations. Therefore, the main points that I will talk about today will focus precisely on the topic of a political settlement, and on how the negotiations on political issues were developing, and why it was not possible to provide for a political settlement.
На том, почему, как шли переговоры по политическим вопросам и почему не удалось обеспечить именно политическое урегулирование. Поскольку я
Since I know much less about humanitarian, economic, and security issues, I will not go into them, although if you have any questions, I will try to answer them for the best of my knowledge.
не буду, хотя если у вас будут вопросы, я постараюсь на них ответить, насколько я владею этой информацией.
And I would like to start by saying that the Minsk agreements did not arise from scratch. And some of the topics that were discussed at the Minsk talks arose from the very beginning of the Ukrainian crisis, the very beginning of the crisis in Donbass.
Которые обсуждались на переговорах в Минске, возникли с самого начала украинского кризиса, с самого начала кризиса на Донбассе.
You can see that the first date I put on this slide is April 17th, 2014, the Geneva Statement, which was supported by Russia, the United States, the European Union, and Ukraine. So what were, in my opinion, the most important points in that statement? It was the linking of the settlement of the conflict in Donbass to the constitutional process in Ukraine, which would take into account the interests of all the regions and political forces in the country. The constitutional process is important because it is within the framework of the constitutional process that we can agree on the rights of the regions. In addition, the leading role of the OSCE Special Monitoring Mission to Ukraine was noted. This is important because it was the OSCE that became the international organization under the auspices of which the negotiations were taking place thereupon. The second important point is the meeting on the sidelines of the commemoration of the 17th anniversary of the Allied landings in Normandy in June 2014. This is the first meeting in the so-called Normandy format. The diplomatic format was created in support of resolving the conflict in Ukraine, the conflict in Donbass. The Normandy format included Russia, Germany, France, and Ukraine. It is important to emphasize here that the meeting took place on the sidelines of a commemoration. There was no official meeting, but nevertheless, it was this meeting that marked the beginning of and gave the name to the Normandy format. It is crucial to emphasize here that the Normandy format was not considered as something alternative or something parallel. It was regarded as a political dialogue to support the negotiations on settling the conflict that were taking place at the contact group level. At the moment when the first stage of hostilities in Donbass was coming to an end in 2014, the Minsk Protocol was signed. This protocol recognized the right of Donbass to a special status within Ukraine. This is very important because the words special status were written particularly in this document. The Minsk Memorandum is also an important document. It details the first point of the Minsk Protocol, which dealt with securing a ceasefire and withdrawal of troops. Finally, on February 12, 2015, after a new escalation of hostilities in Donbass, the package of measures for the implementation of the Minsk Agreement was signed. What is more important, the document was endorsed by a resolution of the UN Security Council. In addition, from 2015 to 2019, 3 high-level summit meetings were held in the Normandy format. This happened after the package of measures for the implementation of the Minsk agreements was signed. There were regular meetings of the contact group and working groups, the very negotiations, and in addition, there were several not quite regular meetings of high representatives of Russia and the United States, which were devoted to discussing the settlement in Donbass. Here one can see just a list of key documents on political settlement. It is important to emphasize that in 2014, Ukraine adopted the law on special order of local self-government in certain areas of the Donetsk and Luhansk regions. Later, this law became one of the important topics and one of the stumbling blocks in the negotiations on political settlement. So, what was Ukraine's position? Here, I would like to emphasize that these are my conclusions about the essence of the Ukrainian position, based on the experience of negotiations that I have, and based on the data from other sources available to all of us as well. To begin with, Ukraine avoided giving up directly on the implementation of the Minsk agreements, not unreasonably believing that the Minsk agreements actually secured a ceasefire regime, albeit not a very reliable one. A rejection of the Minsk agreements was fraught with Russia's recognition of the independence of the Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics. Moreover, from Ukraine's perspective, a rejection of the Minsk agreements could serve as a pretext for the West to withdraw unconditional support for Ukraine and perhaps even lift sanctions against Russia. Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, who is in his public speech, to put it mildly, often candid, once said that the sanctions against Russia are tied to the Minsk agreements, and as we want to keep the sanctions, we therefore have to keep the Minsk agreements.
Санкции против России привязаны к Минским соглашениям. Мы хотим сохранить санкции, значит, мы должны сохранить и Минские соглашения.
It is one of the illustrations of Ukraine's approach to these documents. Federalization of the country has always been unacceptable for the Ukrainian leadership because it was regarded as the first step towards the separation of certain regions from Ukraine. This stance has a long history. It dates back to the 2000s and to the 1990s. Ukraine regarded the special status of Donbas within Ukraine as kind of a first step towards federalization, i.e. the temptation that would push all other regions of the Ukraine to seek a special status for themselves. That is why, by the way, it was the word decentralization that was used in the package of measures for the implementation of the Minsk agreements. That also gave Ukraine certain opportunities for maneuvering. Next, and to my mind the most important, is the political reason for the implementation of the Minsk agreements. Even the mere existence of the Minsk agreements in the eyes of Ukraine, and not only, would amount to the recognition of the heterogeneity of this country and the fact that there are different groups of people who live in different territories, who have different native languages, who have different versions of historical memory, different views on what constitutes the best foreign and domestic policy. It is precisely this recognition of heterogeneity that was and remains unacceptable to the Ukrainian political class, particularly because it undermined the liberal nationalist consensus that developed in Ukraine after 2014. Therefore, the essence of the Ukrainian negotiation strategy was to delay the implementation of the Minsk agreements, not to reject the agreements, but nevertheless to prevent them from being implemented. In my opinion, a quote from an article by Volodymyr Hruboling, a Ukrainian political analyst, is very appropriate here. He is a man with a very interesting biography, who, if I'm not mistaken, was twice Secretary of the National Security and Defense Council of Ukraine, and who was relatively recently awarded the title of Hero of Ukraine. And back in June 2015, he presented the strategy that Ukraine adhered to during the negotiations.
Ту логику, ту стратегию, которую Украина придерживалась на переговорах. Ну, видите,
A limited war of deterrence against Russia and collaborators, that is the shelling of Donetsk and Luhansk, a constant negotiation process without recording any final results, military buildup, increased intensity of international sanctions, rapprochement with NATO and the European Union. See, this is exactly the policy that Ukraine eventually adopted. Please note that there is a thinker in Ukraine who participates in the negotiations, who wrote about the form in which negotiations are desirable for Ukraine, and the Ukrainian leadership has been implementing the strategy for several years. This, in terms of his career as an analyst, in terms of his status and his prestige as an analyst, is quite a significant result. So read this article. There are a lot of interesting qualifying phrases in it that tell us a lot about modern Ukraine. What, from my point of view, was the Russian position? I say from my point of view because, as a participant in the negotiations, I had nothing to do with the development of the strategic line. Therefore, I'm not so much sharing knowledge about the strategic line here, as I'm just speaking about the results of my own observations. To begin with, to my mind, it was important that the Minsk agreements noted the heterogeneity of Ukraine. And if Ukraine is multi-component, if there is political and legal agency of those who were called Russian Ukraine by the famous Ukrainian political analyst Mikhail Pogrebinsky, we understand the reservations that need to be made to this expression. If there is political and legal agency of people who speak Russian and want to preserve this language, who want to give education to their children in this language, who want to preserve the close connections between Ukraine and Russia, those who do not want Ukraine to become a member of military alliances directed against Russia. This in itself could ensure at least the neutrality of Ukraine that Russia has been calling for many years.
Которые хотят сохранить тесные связи Украины и России, которые не хотят, чтобы Украина становилась членом направленных против России военных союзов, то само по себе это может обеспечить тот самый, по крайней мере, нейтралитет Украины, к которому Россия на протяжении многих лет призывала.
Moreover, if on the basis of the Minsk agreement, provided that the very heterogeneity is noted, or the Russian Ukraine is endowed with political agency, it is possible to stop armed conflicts, then they will restart relations with Ukraine and allow to reactivate or develop new levers of political and diplomatic influence on Kiev's foreign and domestic policy.
Рычаги политического, дипломатического влияния на внешнеполитический курс Киева, внешний и внутриполитический.
Some people say, how come? The Minsk agreements are Russia's trump card in the Ukrainian crisis. But I think it's nonsense. The terms of the Minsk agreements were minimalistic. And in fact, they merely suggested a return to good neighborliness, which of course included a rejection of NATO membership. It is pretty obvious to my mind. I would like to draw your attention to the fact that, as I think, Russia's demands related to the Minsk agreements, to the conflict in Donbass, and to the way of resolving it were quite minimalistic. So why they were minimalistic and moderate?
том числе. И это последний пункт. Ведь
I will make a small digression about why at one time Russia reacted so calmly to the collapse of the Warsaw Pact and then to the dissolution of the USSR.
Варшавского договора, а затем и к распаду СССР.
Some may argue that the attitude was not calm at all. They will tell me that the Communist Party has always protested. But I'm now talking about the scale of the protests against the dissolution of the USSR and the attitude of the political elite towards that. This was because the dissolution of the USSR, amongst other things, was seen as part of a very long process of building special relations with the key countries of Western Europe. These processes began not even under Gorbachev with his new thinking, but under Brezhnev with his pipelines. It was thought that if Russia had a reliable partnership with Germany and France, if relations with them were friendly enough, if there were close economic ties with them, which strengthened Russia in terms of technology and Western Europe in terms of resources, then it does not really matter what happens between us. Poland has an internal fear to end up between Russia and Germany. If there is an alliance between Russia and Germany, then Eastern Europe is not a bone of contention, and this is very important. And the Minsk agreements on the part of Russia, in my opinion, was sustained in the same logic as common European home. The common European home, not in terms of values, of course, but in terms of interests, in terms of deep political and economic partnership with the key countries of Western Europe. The Minsk agreements were based on the same logic, which was to let Russia come to an agreement with the Europeans, and together they themselves would establish some kind of order that suits everyone on the continent. Well, I think I don't need to tell you which country of the world is the least interested in such an outcome. Now let's take a look at Ukraine's diplomatic tactics. I believe that the combination of Ukraine's diplomatic and political practices ultimately led to the failure of the Minsk agreements. They were moderate requirements that could have been met based on the interests of good neighborliness and respect for all Ukrainian citizens. However, the political course of Ukraine did not intend either one or the other. I'll tell you more about it now. First thing is the imitation of the implementation of the Minsk agreements. I don't have the document on me to look closely at its text, and in general it is not necessary because it is quite short. The Minsk agreements, both the memorandum and the package of measures for the implementation of the Minsk agreements, included a clause according to which the Donbas militias, who participated in military operations, as well as in any other actions that are illegal in terms of Ukrainian legislation, should be amnestied. In fact, on the part of Donbass, the demand mirrored what was done with regard to the February 2014 coup participants in Kiev. Laws were passed too that excluded them from criminal prosecution. Amnesty is a slightly different thing. Amnesty implies that a criminal case is opened and then closed after an amnesty is granted, either at the investigation stage or the trial stage. Ukraine, if I may say so, has passed an amnesty law, They wrote their own text of a bill. This text, contrary to the requirements of the package of measures, was not agreed with Donbass. Then the Verkhovna Rada of Ukraine voted for this bill. And after that, according to the regulations of the Verkhovna Rada, the bill had to be signed by the chairman of the Verkhovna Rada and then handed over to the president for signature. The chairman of the Verkhovna Rada never signed this bill, for which the Verkhovna Rada voted, and at this point its traces were lost, because its status, even in terms of the regulations of the Rada, remained unclear. What does this mean? Does it mean that, for example, the new speaker can sign the bill, and after that it can be passed to the president? Or is it necessary to adopt a new law? Or is it necessary to vote for it all over again? At the same time, Ukraine was telling everyone that they were implementing the Minsk agreements by passing the amnesty law. Naturally, this law has not worked for a day. And by the way, the same thing was always echoed by American negotiators. They memorized a phrase, which I think had been repeated by US diplomats up until the beginning of this year, that Ukraine was fulfilling as part of the Minsk agreements. The next thing is that Ukrainians made unilateral legal decisions without consulting their negotiating partners. Let's take the law on special order of local self-government in certain areas of the Donetsk and Luhansk regions, Article 10.
Вот 4 закон. Ага, да. Вы могли бы пролистать его вниз до 10 статьи? Я могу его сам листать, интересно. Сейчас. Так, вот 10 статья, заключительные положения. И
At the moment when the law was adopted, this article ended with the third paragraph.
Эта статья заканчивалась на пункте 3.
The Cabinet of Ministers shall without delay ensure the adoption of laws deriving from this law.
В общем, внести, обеспечить принятие законов, вытекающих из этого закона.
And then began exactly what I was about to tell you, namely the package of measures for the implementation of the Minsk agreements, assumed that this law was to come into force within a month after the signing of the package of measures for the implementation of the Minsk agreements, that is, in March 2015. At the time, an obstacle to the enactment of this law was the fact that a list of municipalities with a special order of local self-government has not been adopted.
Муниципальных образований, в которых действует особый порядок местного самоуправления. И Украине предлагалось, точнее, Украина требовала комплекс мер.
The package of measures required Ukraine to adopt such a list. They did adopt it, but without a resolution of the Verkhovna Rada, without listing specific municipalities in which the law should operate. They referred there to the line of contact between Ukraine, on the one hand, and the Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics on the other, without listing specific municipalities. This in itself was an obstacle to the entry into force of the law. Moreover, at the initiative of the President of Ukraine, Poroshenko, the law on special order of local self-government was amended, which particularly blocked its entry into force. Paragraph 4. Articles 2.9 of this law shall be enforced from the date of entry into office of a local self-government in certain districts elected in snap elections. Then there are the requirements for holding the elections. In compliance with the principles of general, equal, free, transparent elections, as well as publicity and openness of the electoral process as the basis principles of the electoral law. Confirming universally recognized international standards forming part of the national legislation of Ukraine, and with mandatory compliance with OSCE standards, ensuring the participation of international observers, safe conditions for the participation of official observers, the withdrawal of all illegal armed groups.
Да, можно чуть-чуть вниз, да. Да. Ага. Смотрите, с обеспечением участия наблюдения международных наблюдателей, безопасных условий.
Their equipment, as well as militants, preventing illegal interference in the electoral process, including by illegal armed groups.
Незаконного вмешательства в избирательный процесс, в том числе со стороны незаконных вооруженных формирований.
It all sounds like fairly general phrases, but what are we talking about here in essence? The point, in fact, is that Ukraine reserves the right to judge whether the elections met all the necessary standards.
Были ли выборы соответствующими всем необходимым стандартам, во-первых.
Ukraine declares that the elections should be held in accordance with the legislation of Ukraine. I will tell you why this is important. Ukraine talks about the safe conditions for official observers and about the withdrawal of all illegal armed groups. What does it mean? Let the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics disarm, adopt Ukrainian legislation to hold elections, and then maybe this law will come into force. Maybe because there are still a lot of other conditions that can be interpreted completely differently.
Свобода предвыборной агитации, равных возможностей доступа к средствам массовой информации, восстановление с этой целью украинского теле- и радиовещания. То есть пустите украинские СМИ на Донбасс в полном объеме, и только при таком условии могут пройти выборы.
Ensuring the principles of a multi-party system, equal rights and opportunities to participate in the electoral process. It is about the fact that Ukrainian political parties should take part in elections in certain areas of the Donetsk and Luhansk regions, despite the fact that these Ukrainian political parties have not actually operated in Donbass since the very beginning of the conflict. Ensuring the guarantee of free expression of will and secret voting, as well as the electoral rights of internally displaced persons. As it is known, several million people were forced to leave the territory of Donbass. Some of them left for Russia, and some of them left for the territory controlled by the authorities of Ukraine. At the same time, it is an absolutely correct requirement that displaced persons should participate in elections, but it is also no coincidence that we're talking here about the voting rights of internally displaced persons. This requirement is not about those who left for Russia. It is only about those who did remain on the territory of Ukraine. It was quite predictable. If the elections do take place, Ukraine will try to open more polling stations for internally displaced people, and they did not want those in Russia to vote.
То есть понятно, что они не хотели, чтобы проголосовали те, кто находится на территории России. Пролистайте, пожалуйста, дальше. Вот. То есть
In other words, on the one hand, Ukraine adopted this key law for political settlement, but on the other hand, it unilaterally included provisions that precluded the entry into force of the law and that in fact significantly changed the terms of the package of measures.
И которые на самом деле существенным образом меняли условия комплекса мер. А сейчас откройте, пожалуйста, файл, который называется комплекс мер. Это 3. Так, это здесь я уже, наверное, могу листать. Вот посмотрите 4-й пункт.
The fourth point of the package of measures is to start a dialogue on the modalities of local elections in accordance with Ukrainian legislation and the law on interim order.
Начать диалог о модальности местных выборов в соответствии с украинским законодательством и законом о временном порядке, который мы уже читали. Можно дальше? Ну вот, собственно говоря, то самое требование, о котором я вам говорил. Пролистайте, пожалуйста, вниз. Что здесь важно?
What is important here? The fact is that the law on special order of local self-government was not the only issue. Because, as it was written in the package of measures, there was also a need for constitutional reform that would allow taking into account the interests of different groups within the population of Ukraine.
Которая позволила бы учесть интересы разных групп в составе населения Украины. Эта тема звучала с самого начала. И, конечно, закон об особом
The law on special order of local self-government made no sense if there were no corresponding changes in the constitution, which Ukraine also blocked. This was another element of the tactics of the Ukrainian side.
Элемент тактики. В какой-то момент действительно в 2015 году.
By the autumn of 2015, after the very long, hard work of diplomats, not even in Minsk, but at external negotiating platforms, mainly in the Normandy format, Ukraine was close to adopting a new constitution that would contain a reference, just a reference, to the law on special order and local self-government.
В которой содержалась бы новую конституцию, в которой содержалась бы ссылка, всего лишь ссылка на закон об особом порядке местного самоуправления. Но
But on the day of voting on this law, there was a clash. Mass riots took place near the walls of the Verkhovna Rada. At the same time, a representative of one of the Ukrainian radical paramilitary organizations threw a grenade at the servicemen of the internal troops who were standing in a cordon. Several people died, and after that, Ukraine scaled down work on the draft constitution on the grounds that people would not understand. Look how people are protesting. They're even throwing grenades.
Но я хотел бы попросить вас пролистать еще дальше. Можно чуть-чуть вверх. Да, вот, чтобы было видно примечание.
Actually, the key points about the special status of Donbass, the special order of local self-government, as they were enshrined in the package, and let me remind you, in the Security Council resolution in support of this package of measures, in my opinion, are not Russia's trump card. We're talking about minimal requirements.
На мой взгляд, здесь речь не идет ни о какой золотой акции, речь действительно идет о требованиях совершенно минималистичных.
As for Ukraine's unilateral legislative decisions that have undermined the Minsk agreements,
к этим односторонним правовым решениям, односторонним законодательным решениям, которые подрывали Минские соглашения, я бы отнес...
I would also add the language law, which significantly limited the use of the Russian language, the repeal of the law on state language policy, which assumed that the Russian language had the status of regional language, laws on education, which dramatically reduced education in Russian and made it practically impossible to get free of charge. The law on indigenous peoples, which sounds simply racist in some of its paragraphs, and so on.
В некоторых своих пунктах звучит попросту российски. И так далее.
Here, of course, the most scandalous one was the so-called law on the state policy of the transition period. It really assumed a special status for Donbass after it became part of Ukraine, but in fact it imposed restrictions on the civil and political rights for the residents of the region.
Который вводил, по сути дела, ограничения гражданских политических прав для жителей этого региона. Такой особый статус.
That is, so to speak, a special status, the wrong way around, a negative special status. Of course, all these decisions undermined the Minsk agreements and hindered negotiations. In addition, Ukraine sought to have Russia recognized as a party to the conflict. The lion's share of the efforts of the Ukrainian negotiators was devoted to this. This was done in various ways, starting with direct demands. For example, Ukrainian representatives at the negotiations, being at the same table with representatives of Donetsk and Luhansk, stated that they did not want to conduct direct negotiations with them, did not even listen to them, and negotiated only with Russia. These actions included, and we're now talking about negotiations on other issues rather than political, the initiative of the Ukrainian side to seek that the Russian Federation issue death certificates for those who went missing during the conflict in 2014-2015. And the logic of the Ukrainian side was clear. The Russian Federation issues death certificates, which means that the Russian Federation killed those people. The Ukrainians tried to manipulate the agenda. For example, in 2017, Ukrainian negotiators actively promoted the idea of a new working group within the framework of the contact group, which they spent quite a lot of time on. They would deal with the transfer to Ukraine of the border in the area controlled by the Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics. There were also attempts to raise the issue of Crimea during the discussion of the Minsk agreement. Russia, of course, did not respond to this, and the OSCE representatives should be given credit for not responding either. Nevertheless, there were such attempts. What is more, one of the Ukrainian negotiators, the former ambassador of Ukraine to the United States, would come to every meeting with an old Soviet edition of international law documents and would leaf through the volume and read something from it out loud at the meetings. And finally, and I allow myself such a colloquial phrase, the Ukrainians were just messing around. The most striking example is the so-called Steinmeier formula. We were talking about the law on special order of local self-government and about the unilateral amendments Ukraine adopted to it, blocking the validity of this law. It should be said that the problem was raised at the negotiations immediately. A significant part of the time in the political negotiations in the summer of 2015 was spent explaining to Ukraine that, in accordance with the Minsk agreements, it could not and should not unilaterally block the operation of the law on special order of local self-government. The situation reached an impasse when Ukraine said that they had put forward demands for elections, and after the elections in certain areas of Donetsk and Luhansk regions, these areas would receive a special status. In response, they were told that Ukraine should enforce this law without any stipulations of this kind.
им на это говорили: вы вообще-то должны ввести в действие этот закон без всяких оговорок такого рода. Тема дошла
The issue reached the Normandy format at the highest level, and if I'm not mistaken, in October 2015, a meeting of the heads of state of the Normandy format was held in Paris, at which the Steinmeier formula was suggested and agreed upon.
формата, на которой была предложена и согласована вот та самая формула Штайнмайера. Что такое формула
So what is the
Штайнмайера?
Steinmeier formula?
Окей,
If Ukrainians want the law to come into force after the elections,
выборов,
then let the law come into force after the elections.
закон вступит в силу после выборов.
It will come into force as a temporary one on the day of the elections in certain districts of Donetsk and Luhansk regions, and as a permanent one after the OSCE Office for Democratic Institutions and Human Rights issues a report on the quality of these elections,
Правам человека
and it will be confirmed that they met all the standards.
о качестве этих выборов, и они там будут признаны соответствующими всем стандартам. В этом,
This, in
собственно,
fact, was the Steinmeier formula.
там
The wording could have been modified somehow, but not significantly, and the point was precisely that the law comes into force after the elections.
что закон вступает в силу после выборов. На самом деле это была
And in fact, it was a concession by both Donbass and Russia to Ukraine in order to move this negotiation process forward.
Сдвинуть этот весь процесс с мертвой точки, сдвинуть переговоры с мертвой точки. Что сделала
What did Ukraine do? For several years, Ukraine absolutely refused to admit that such a formula existed and that it had been agreed upon. They literally refused to admit it.
Буквально отказывался это признавать.
The president of Ukraine has agreed to this with his colleagues from Russia, Germany, and France, and the Ukrainian negotiators who come to a contact group meeting in Minsk say that they do not know of any such arrangements. I'm not exaggerating, it really was like that. That is why, before the next summit of the Normandy format, the contact group specifically asked the heads of state to explain what the Steinmeier formula was.
Специально обратилась к главам государств с просьбой растолковать, а что такое формула Штайнмайера.
It was formulated once again, written down on paper, and submitted to the contact group. Ukraine still refused to discuss this issue for another 3 years. The Ukrainian negotiators put their signature on a document in which it was written that the law on special order of local self-government would come into force on a temporary basis on the election day, and permanently after the OSCE would evaluate these elections in autumn of 2018. That is, 4 years after the formula had been agreed upon. I don't know what to call it other than messing around. As for the position of the OSCE, from my perspective, they could have done more to ensure that the Minsk agreements were implemented. But, nevertheless, their stance was their stance. This position implied that they refused to assess the actions of the parties that they gave, to my mind, biased assessments, because when once again in Ukraine some member of parliament speaks and says that they need to terminate the Minsk agreements, or when President Zelensky says the same thing, no one pays attention to it. When the Russian Federation decided on a simplified access to Russian citizenship for residents of certain areas of the Donetsk and Luhansk regions, the OSCE coordinator was outraged. Delegates from Russia decided that citizenship issues were an internal affair of the Russian Federation. The next thing is that the OSCE refused to record the conduct of these negotiations. Back in 2015, an amazing story happened. A Ukrainian negotiator agreed, as part of the discussion of the very modalities of local elections, so how local elections should have been held, with the proposal of the republics to use the majority voting system. Such a system was chosen because there are no political parties in certain districts, they cannot operate. To be more precise, on the one hand, they stopped their activities, and on the other hand, many politicians who work on the territory of certain districts cannot speak on behalf of Ukrainian political parties. And the Ukrainian negotiator agreed to this, and it was even said by the OSCE coordinator at the contact group meeting that there is such an agreement. 2 weeks passed, and the next meeting started, where the Ukrainian negotiator said that this was a personal opinion of a member of the delegation, which had nothing to do either with the position of the delegation as a whole or with the official position of the Ukraine. And if it were possible to record on paper the agreements already reached, at least in the form of a protocol, there would be less space for such turnarounds. However, Ukraine categorically objected to recording the results of the negotiations, and the OSCE also did not insist on this. In my opinion, they generally implicitly supported Ukraine's course of recognizing Russia as a party to the conflict. Although Russia has always insisted that it was not, and is not a party to this conflict in Donbass, an internal Ukrainian conflict, but rather acts as a mediator. However, the OSCE diplomats did not support this position. Finally, France and Germany, as the members of the Normandy format, firstly, they obviously lacked leverage over Ukraine. We have written several articles and published a book called The Ukrainian Crisis, edited by Dr. Sushentov and me. One of the articles describes the fact that although Germany paid the most to Ukraine from 2014 to 2019, except for the help of international organizations such as the IMF, the key political levers were not with Ukraine's European partners, but with American partners. And of course, Kiev would not listen to Germany and France. But it must also be acknowledged that they did not make any significant efforts to convince Ukraine to comply with the Minsk agreements. The next thing I was speaking about is that, in my opinion, the Minsk agreements and Russia's strategy towards the internal conflict in Ukraine had for many years fit into the picture of a common European home. And here, Germany and France found themselves, or decided that they found themselves, facing a hard choice between a European home and Atlantic solidarity. They ended up choosing Atlantic solidarity because the choice in favor of the European home was, of course, focused on the implementation of the Minsk agreements, and the closing of that page and the choice in favor of the Atlantic identity was completely different. The next thing is, in my opinion, one of the most unpleasant and unconstructive things that Russia has encountered in recent years from the Europeans. It is their tendency to maintain the myth of their neutrality. In other words, when retired NATO diplomats come to Moscow and start shedding crocodile tears at expert meetings saying, "How? Russians and Ukrainians are two close nations. We really want to bring peace between you. How about Russia recognizes itself as a party to the conflict?" I'm not exaggerating too much now. They did indeed say something like that. They, on the one hand, supported this myth, and on the other hand, believed in it themselves. And this made it impossible to discuss key issues, including European security issues. They quite consistently rejected any hints about discussing issues related to Ukraine, except for the Minsk agreements, and unreasonably narrowed the subject of the Minsk agreements.
Обсуждением каких-то вопросов, касающихся Украины, кроме Минских соглашений. Так вот, неоправданно сужали тематику Минских соглашений. Например,
For example, they reacted negatively if they were reminded that Ukraine restricts the scope of the use of the Russian language and practically prohibits education in Russian. They said that it had nothing to do with the Minsk agreements and it was not worth discussing. And then they ended up in solidarity with Ukraine's position. I strongly recommend you read the diplomatic correspondence that the Russian Foreign Ministry published last fall. This is the correspondence of the Russian Foreign Minister with his colleagues from Germany and France. You can follow how the correspondence developed, how they essentially suggested that Russia should be considered a party to the conflict, how they refused to discuss issues related to the Russian language in Ukraine, although it was one of the issues discussed in the Minsk agreements, how they insisted that they would not assess Ukraine's non-compliance with the Minsk agreements. They eventually came to solidarity with the Ukrainian position. And finally, the last thing I wanted to tell you about is the last summit of the Normandy format on December 9th, 2019. Here's a quote that refers to the political aspects of the settlement. It was not possible to include this in detail in the final statement of the summit. Nevertheless, there are some points here, namely the coordination of all legal aspects of the special order of local self-government, the integration of the Steinmeier formula into Ukrainian legislation, This requirement is also a jointly agreed outcome, which has been stated explicitly, and a point that is very difficult to circumvent. And yet Ukraine has managed for the next few years to circumvent it. Ukraine proposed its amendments to the law on special order of local self-government, where it included all its wishes that it had formulated back in 2015, namely the withdrawal of armed formulations, the multi-party system, Ukrainian media, and so on. In other words, Ukraine kept the condition that it formulated for the elections unilaterally, and also suggested adding the text of the Steinmeier formula about the entry into force of the law on a temporary basis before it did on a permanent one. And if you remember, last fall the topic of a new normative format summit was discussed quite vigorously. Ukraine did their best to make sure the summit takes place. What would a summit of the Normandy format, a meeting between Zelensky and Putin, two hands of Germany and France, mean when Ukraine does not implement the decisions of the previous summit? That would mean allowing it not to implement them further. That is, we agreed on something, did nothing, and then we meet again to talk. So again, there are no more requirements for Ukraine. This is how it's translated from the diplomatic language into Russian. I have said many times when asked about the strength of Ukrainian diplomacy that it lies in its complete lack of shame. And the underlying impression from the negotiations with those whom Kiev sent to Minsk is a feeling of complete shamelessness and stupidity. Of course, this would not have been possible on Ukraine's part if not for the West's position, which was also that the Minsk agreements should not be implemented.
не должны быть выполнены.
Thank you very much.